Welcome back. This is part 3 of my summary of the Roanoke Voyages, and we get finally to the so-called lost colony. Before looking at what actually happened and trying to understand that in the context of what had already happened, let's turn our attention to the 2022 History Channel treatment of this year. A permanent colony of planters and families was started on Roanoke Island in the vicinity of Lane's 1585 fort. Sometime later, a first child, Virginia Dare, was born, and the History Channel treatment continues with, quote, "But the happy times won't last long. While the colony's first summer was fairly successful, they soon realized they were ill-equipped." Then with a small search group comes looking for them 3 years later, the treatment says, quote, "3 years prior, the colonists seemed off to a good start in their new home." Keep these phrases in mind. First summer was fairly successful and seemed off to a good start in their new home, as we dive in with a little timeline of what actually happened in the context of what we know already happened previously. First, though, a little background. With all the troubles from the previous year, why would anybody in their right mind even consider establishing a non-military colony right here? Turns out they had no intention to go to Roanoke. 60 miles above this picture is the Chesapeake area that had friendly natives, good available farmland, deep harbors for a colony, and also a potential military post that could raid the Spanish and hide their ships. John White may have even been there the previous winter. The hope in recruiting the group was to have about 150 people evenly split between men and women. In the end, they had a little over 100, with 9 children, 14 women, and the rest men. Though John White is an impactful artist, he was a terrible leader. Yet he was for some reason appointed to be the leader of this colony, and he was the leader on the voyages over there. That means the pilot on the ship was supposed to report to John White. There's several instances on this voyage of conflict between John White and the pilot Ferdinando. Ferdinando always wins. Further, John White tends to pass blame to Ferdinando whenever something goes wrong. John White here and elsewhere commands no respect and seems poor at persuading people to follow his leadership efforts. On their way heading up to the Chesapeake region, John White wants to stop off at Roanoke for maybe a couple of reasons. The first is he wants to check on the 15 people left by Grenville the year before, and the second reason is perhaps he wants to leave off Manio to be established as the Lord of Roanoke in the name of Raleigh. What happens next is weird, and realize the only historical record we have is what John White said after the fact. White claims that Ferdinando's position was, "That's it, we're dropping you off here at Roanoke. It's getting too late in the summer, and I have to get back." That's fine as far as it goes, but looking back, Ferdinando's ship sat there and didn't leave for another month, so it just doesn't carry much weight. Seems for whatever reason, John White really didn't mind being left off there. Perhaps he felt he personally had fine relations with the natives and could work it out. Perhaps he felt frightened of going someplace where he didn't have Manio as interpreter. We don't know, but they stayed there at Roanoke at least temporarily. Historian Michael Oberg wrote in his blog, "Every time John White was faced with an important choice, he made the wrong one." So let's look on a calendar at this, quote, fairly successful summer where, quote, the colonists were off to a good start in their new home. They start by moving their provisions from the anchored ship at Hatteras to the north end of Roanoke Island, where there were some overgrown houses from the colony from the year before, and they'd be building a few new ones. The planters arrived on the 23rd and 25th of July, so let's start our calendar on the 26th, the first day that they're all there. And we may as well as anticipate the last day we know anything about what the colonists were doing. That's right here. On the third day here, they're probably unloading the ship. Some people might be staying at the ship, some at the fort, and who knows where the children are. But on this day, one of White's assistants, George Howe, was murdered while off crabbing alone, and he seems to have been murdered with a message. He was shot with 16 arrows, and his face and head were bashed in. This probably stops all activity, and the terrified people probably get back to the ship and on the next day confer about what to do. You've got 15 people who were left there the year before who are missing, and now Howe is murdered right on Roanoke. They devise a plan, and the very next day take 20 people in the pinnace with Manio and White and Stafford and go 50 miles south to the island of Croatoan. Although Manio now wears English clothes, and there's no evidence he's actually been there in the last 3 years, this is the island Manio comes from, and his mother and other relatives are there. They're greeted upon arrival the next day by natives with bows and arrows ready for a fight, and the English have their guns raised, though, so the natives start to flee. That is until Manio calls out in Algonquin, and subsequently all is good and they're invited to the town for a meal. The talks go into a second day. White says, "Hey, we want to renew old friendships. We want to live together in peace. Wondering if you can Help us. Who amongst the other towns we have to worry about, and is there any way we can fix this? The Croatoans are not without concerns. They look for assurances right away that the English won't steal their corn, and they have no interest in trading for it because corn is scarce. They also look for assurances that settlers won't harm them when they're off the island, like evidently happened the year before, and they bring out a person with an apparent disability that originated from Lane's aggression. They even look for a sign or a symbol by which the English might identify them if encountered off the island. The English learned that 15 men that were left there the year before were attacked by a consortium of people from Sekatan, Dasamankapuk, and Akuskogak, and that Wanchese and other remnants of Dasamankapuk killed George Howe. Now let's think this through. There's only 2 intervening days between the day Howe was murdered 3 days ago and today. It's a 2-day canoe trip each way between Roanoke and Croatoan, so the only way the Croatoan would know about Howe's murder is if the Croatoan were there, or at least at Dasamankapuk. If the Croatoan were sympathetic to, if not complicit in, the efforts to drive the visitors away, now would not be the time to reveal it. White asked the Croatoans for help arranging a summit. If they could send that word out to the different leaders of the different towns that maybe we could all meet at Roanoke in a week and we can talk about it and let bygones be bygones. So we hope to see them all there in a week, or let us know if it looks like that's not going to work. The pinnace with the group gets back to the ships at Hatteras the next day, and they start a nervous week of waiting. The week passes with no summit and no word from the Croatoan. That night before sunrise, they take the pinnace across the short bit of water to Dasamankapuk. They sneak up onto the land, and seeing people around a campfire, they start shooting, killing at least one person. They're about to shoot another person when they realize it's a woman with a child on her back. In the confusion, somebody calls out to Stafford, a Croatoan who knows him. There's been a major mistake, just the mistake they were implored to avoid the week before. Turns out the Croatoans came up to gather the corn from what they expected to be an abandoned camp, and the woman was the wife of a Croatoan leader. They gathered the corn and took the woman and child and others back to Roanoke. Manio blamed the Croatoan for the mishaps. Had the Croatoan leader come to Roanoke at the end of the week as promised, this wouldn't have happened. 3 days later, Manio is christened as the Lord of Roanoke and Dasamankapuk and rewarded for his faithful service. So let's stop and review. There's only 2 more weeks before everything goes dark and we know nothing more about what the colony is doing. At this point, they've probably done very little because they're dealing with the terrorist threat out there. They tried diplomacy, and that failed. They tried direct hostile strike, and that failed too. 2 things happened 5 days later on the 18th. First, they finished unloading the ship. Second, a child, Virginia Dare, is born. 3 days after that, White is having a serious argument with the assistant. Somebody's got to go back with the ships and explain that we're not okay and we need help. White's trying to get somebody else to go, and as usual, he loses the argument. On the 22nd, there's an intervention. Basically, all the men, the planters and the assistants, tell White, you've got to be the one to go. On the 23rd, the women join in, and everybody's talking with one voice. White's objection is bizarre. He's worried about his stuff. He knows they're planning to not stay there on Roanoke and instead move 50 miles into the Main, and he's worried his stuff will get spoiled and pilfered. They actually have to sign a pledge, 2 pledges really, which they did on the 25th. The first said, if anything happens to White's stuff, they're good for it, and they'll make him whole, or his heirs, or whatever. The second is they had to sign that they were basically forcing him to go because he was worried about being judged for leaving. 2 days later, John White left with the ships, and that's the last we know of this group of people. So here we are. When the History Channel says the first summer was fairly successful, that's it. That's the first summer. When they say the colonists were off to a good start in their new home, that's the good start.